She didn't cry when her father handed her off like a debt he was finally done paying. Abigail Turner pressed her mother's old kerchief against her palm, lifted her chin, and walked through the gate of a stranger's ranch without looking back, because there was nothing behind her worth looking at anymore. If you've ever been made to feel like a burden by the very people who were supposed to love you, stay with me until the very end of this story. Subscribe to my channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter arrived on the Tuesday. Abigail Turner was in the yard pulling weeds from the kitchen garden when she heard her father's boots hit the porch boards in that particular way, not heavy, not angry, but deliberately slow. The kind of slow that meant he'd already made up his mind about something and wasn't interested in hearing different. She didn't look up right away. She'd learned a long time ago that looking up too quickly gave him the impression she cared about what was coming. And caring in Harlan Turner's house was a weakness he had a way of using against you. Abigail. She pulled a stubborn root from the ground and set it in the bucket beside her knee. Abigail, I'm talking to you. I heard you, Papa. He came down the 2 porch steps and stopped a few feet away. She could see his boots in her peripheral vision, cracked leather, worn down at the left heel, the way they'd been for 3 years, because he wouldn't spend the money to fix them. Wouldn't let her fix them either, even though she knew how. Got a letter from Ethan Cole up on Painted Ridge. She finally looked up. Her father was holding a folded piece of paper like it was something valuable. Harlan Turner didn't hold things like they were valuable unless they were going to make him money. Ethan Cole, she repeated. The rancher, the one and only. He unfolded the letter slowly, more for effect than for reading. She suspected he'd already memorized every word. Man needs a wife. His housekeeper left last winter, his cook left in the spring, and he can't keep the domestic side of that operation running and manage the cattle both. Abigail set her gardening tool down in the dirt. He's looking for someone to run his household, she said. Not a question, a statement, because she already knew where this was going, and she needed to hear herself say it out loud before her father said it for her just to make sure she understood it correctly. He's looking for a wife, Harlan said. There's a difference. Is there? Her father's jaw tightened. Don't use that tone with me. What tone is that, Papa? The one that makes you sound like you think you're smarter than everyone in this county. He folded the letter back up. You're 26 years old. You've turned down 2 decent proposals. You've made it clear you don't intend to make your situation here any easier. My situation? She stood up and brushed the dirt from her hands. You mean the situation where I cook every meal in this house, keep every account, treat every sick animal on this property, and somehow still manage to be the problem? You are the problem, he said, and his voice didn't rise, which was somehow worse than if it had. You always have been. Your mother knew it. God rest her, she loved you anyway, but she knew it. You don't bend, Abigail. You don't fit. And I am 61 years old, and I am done trying to find a place for you in a life that you make harder every single day. The words landed the way she'd always known they would if he ever said them out loud. She'd heard them in the spaces between things for years, in the way he introduced her to people, in the way he talked about her brothers, in the way he'd looked at her mother's grave and then looked at Abigail like she was a pale and disappointing replacement for something irreplaceable. She'd heard those words 100 times, without them ever being spoken. But hearing them spoken was still different. She didn't let him see it land. When? She asked. 3 days. And if I say no? Harlan Turner looked at her with something in his eyes that might have been guilt if he'd been a different kind of man. But he wasn't a different kind of man, so it was just decision. You won't say no, he said. You're too practical for that. You know as well as I do that this is the best offer you're going to get. He went back inside. She stood in the kitchen garden for a long time after he left, holding her mother's old kerchief that she kept in her apron pocket, the way another woman might keep a prayer card, rubbing the soft cotton between her fingers. Thinking about the fact that her father was probably right, which was the most humiliating part of all of it. She was 26. She had no money of her own. She had skills that other people underestimated until they needed them desperately. And she had a father who had just very calmly and without any particular cruelty, beyond the cruelty of honesty, told her that she was a problem he was finished carrying. She could fight it. She could refuse and stay and make his life difficult out of sheer stubbornness. Or she could go to Painted Ridge Ranch and meet a stranger and find out if a different life was possible. She put the kerchief back in her pocket. She went inside and started packing. 3 days later, in the thick heat of a Colorado July, a wagon carried Abigail Turner up into the mountains with everything she owned in a single trunk and a cloth bag. The driver was a man named Pell, who worked occasional jobs for her father and who had the particular gift of being able to say absolutely nothing for long stretches of time, which Abigail appreciated enormously. She watched the valley disappear behind her and the pine trees thicken on either side of the road, and she did not think about her father's house, or her brothers who hadn't come to say goodbye, or the kitchen garden she'd been tending for 12 years. She thought about the letter, which she had not been permitted to read, but which she had heard enough of to understand that Ethan Cole was 38 years old, had built Painted Ridge Ranch by himself, starting at the age of 22. After his parents died, ran cattle and horses in the high mountain pastures, and had, according to the brief and businesslike nature of his communication, a straightforward need for a capable woman to manage his domestic operation. He had not written anything about love. She found that oddly comforting. Love in her experience was what people said when they wanted something from you and didn't want to call it what it was. A man who wrote a letter about practical needs was at least being honest about the transaction. "You ever met him?" she asked Pell. Pell shifted his grip on the reins. "Cole few times. He comes down to Ridgeline in the winter for supplies mostly. Quiet man." "Quiet how?" "Quiet like he don't talk unless he's got something to say." Pell considered this. "Which ain't how most men are." "No," Abigail agreed. "It ain't." They rode in silence for another hour. The air got cooler as they climbed. The light changed thicker, golden filtering through stands of aspen and lodgepole pine. Abigail had never been this far into the mountains before. Her whole life had been lived in the valley. She hadn't known the world got like this up here, quieter, larger somehow, like the mountain had its own gravity that made everything else feel smaller and less urgent. She thought unexpectedly, "I could breathe here," and then immediately chided herself for thinking it because she was being delivered to a stranger's door like a piece of furniture he'd ordered from a catalog, and she had no business finding the scenery romantic. Painted Ridge Ranch announced itself with a long wooden fence line that ran along the road for nearly half a mile. The fence was old, but sound repaired in places with newer wood, every post set straight. That told her something about the man before she ever saw him. Some men let fences rot because they didn't see the point in maintaining something that wasn't immediately broken. Other men fixed things before they had to because they understood that small failures became large ones if you let them. Ethan Cole fixed things before he had to. She filed that away. The gate was a tall wooden frame with painted ridge burned into a crossbeam at the top. Pell stopped the wagon in front of it and set the brake. "This is as far as I go," he said. Abigail looked at him. "Your father only paid me to bring you to the gate," Pell said with the mildly apologetic tone of a man explaining something he found distasteful, but not distasteful enough to have refused the money. She climbed down from the wagon without his help and pulled her trunk and bag down after her. It landed in the dust of the road with a heavy thud. She straightened up and looked at the gate and then back at Pell, who was already turning the wagon around. "Thank you for the ride," she said. He didn't answer. The wagon rolled back down the road and disappeared around a bend in the trees, and she was alone. She stood in front of the gate of Painted Ridge Ranch with a trunk, a bag, her mother's kerchief in her pocket, and the particular sensation of being a woman who has just had the floor drop out from under her life and has not yet decided whether she is going to fall or find something to stand on. She pushed the gate open. She walked through. She found him at the far end of a long fence line, crouched down examining a post that had healed slightly in the summer dry ground, a metal bar in one hand, and a look of focused concentration on his face that suggested he was not a man who did things halfway. He heard her before she reached him. She saw his shoulders change, not tense, just alert, and he stood and turned around, and she got her first look at Ethan Cole. He was tall. Not ostentatiously tall, just the kind of tall that comes from a life of physical work, the kind that settles into a man's frame so completely that it stopped being a detail and became a fact. Dark hair, dark eyes, a beard that was not unkempt, but also not particularly concerned with its own appearance. Hands that were clearly the hands of someone who worked with them constantly. A face that was somewhere between 35 and 45, weathered in the way that mountain air weathers things not harshly but honestly. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back. "You're Abigail Turner," he said. "I am." He looked past her toward the gate, then back at her. "Pell didn't bring you up to the house." "Pell brought me to the gate." She kept her voice even. Apparently his fee covered the gate. Something moved through Ethan Cole's expression, not anger, but a kind of quiet assessment of the information. He looked at her trunk, sitting in the dust 30 yards away, where she'd left it. "How long were you walking?" he asked. "About 10 minutes. He nodded once, set the metal bar down against the fence post, and walked past her toward the trunk without another word. He picked it up. It was heavy. She knew it was heavy. She'd watched Pell strain with it, and he carried it with one hand and her bag with the other and started toward the house. After a moment, she followed him. "Mr. Cole," she said when she caught up. "Ethan?" "Ethan," she adjusted. "I want to be straightforward with you about the situation." "I'd appreciate that. My father sent me here because he's decided I'm more burden than asset in his household. I'm aware of that. I'm not under any illusions about what this arrangement is." She kept her eyes forward as she walked, watching the ground. "I can cook. I can keep accounts. I can manage a household budget. I know enough about animal medicine to treat most common ailments in horses and cattle. I'm a hard worker, and I don't complain, and I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not to impress you, because if this arrangement requires me to pretend, then it won't work anyway." He was quiet for several steps. "That's a lot of information," he said. "I find it's better to say difficult things early." "Can't argue with that." Another pause. "I should tell you something too, then." "All right. I didn't write that letter because I was looking for company," he said. "I wrote it because this ranch has more work in it than one person can run alone, and I've been losing ground for 2 years trying to do both sides of it myself." He set the trunk down at the bottom of the porch steps and turned to face her for the first time since they'd been walking. "I didn't ask your father for you specifically. I wrote to 3 families in the valley. He was the only one who answered." She held his gaze. "He was the only one with a daughter he wanted gone," she said. "Maybe." Ethan didn't flinch from it. "That's between him and whatever he's got to live with. It doesn't say anything about you." "Most people would say it says quite a bit about me." "Most people," he said, "are wrong about more things than they know." He picked up the trunk again and carried it up the porch steps. "I'll show you the house. You can tell me what you think needs doing, and we can talk about what this arrangement looks like going forward." He opened the front door and held it. She walked through. The ranch hands found out about her within the hour. There were 4 of them. A grizzled older man named Walt, who had been with Ethan since the early years and who viewed the ranch with the proprietary affection of a man who'd helped build something from nothing. 2 brothers from Texas named Cord and Davy Hatch, who were competent and likable in the uncomplicated way of young men who haven't been tested yet. And a quiet, watchful Mexican vaquero named Ramon, who had ridden with Ethan for 3 years and who said very little but noticed everything. Walt was the first to say what the others were thinking. He found Ethan in the barn that afternoon and planted himself in the doorway with his arms crossed and his expression set in the particular configuration that meant he'd decided something was his business, even if it wasn't. "She ain't what I expected," Walt said. Ethan didn't look up from the saddle he was checking. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Something softer." Walt scratched his jaw. "She was going through the kitchen like she was drawing up battle plans." opened every cupboard, wrote things in a little book, looked at the accounts register on the desk in the front room, and didn't say anything, but her face said plenty. Her face say what she found. Told me the accounts are a mess, and we've been overpaying for feed by about 15%. Walt paused. In so many words. Ethan set the saddle on the rack and straightened up. She's right. I know she's right. I don't have the head for numbers that she apparently does. She's going to want to change things. That's why she's here. Walt was quiet for a moment. The boys are going to test her. You know that. Let them. Ethan picked up a brush and started on the nearest horse, moving with the practiced ease of a man who found more comfort in physical tasks than in conversation. She'll handle it. How do you know? Because she walked 10 minutes through mountain heat with a trunk she couldn't carry and didn't say a word about it until I asked. He ran the brush along the horse's flank. A woman like that doesn't get broken by ranch hands with something to prove. Walt studied him for a moment, with the particular look of a man who's known someone long enough to read between the lines. Don't go getting ideas, Ethan. I'm not getting ideas. You got that look. I don't have a look. You absolutely have a look. Walt uncrossed his arms and pushed off the doorframe. Just go slow. That's all I'm saying. She just got here, and she's got enough to deal with without you adding to it. Ethan looked at his old friend. I know how to go slow. You know how to go nowhere, Walt said, not unkindly. That's different. He walked out before Ethan could respond. Cord Hatch made his move at supper. He wasn't being cruel exactly. He was 23 years old and accustomed to a particular order of things, and a strange woman in the kitchen disrupting that order made him feel the particular discomfort of a young man whose certainties have been quietly questioned. Abigail had made a simple supper, beans, salt pork, cornbread, and a pot of coffee that was by any objective measure the best coffee that had been produced in that kitchen in recent memory. She set it on the table and took her place at the end nearest the kitchen, and Cord looked at the food and then at her and said, "We usually have biscuits." The table went quiet. Walt looked at the ceiling. Davy looked at his boots. Ramon, who rarely gave anything away, directed a very brief and very pointed look at Cord that Cord didn't catch. Ethan, at the head of the table, picked up his fork. Abigail looked at Cord with the expression of a woman calculating something. "You made the biscuits before?" she asked. "Well, no, ma'am, but then you'd like to start. I'm happy to teach you." Cord blinked. "I ain't saying I should make them." "Then who should?" "I just meant." "I know what you meant," Abigail said pleasantly. "You meant that things were done a certain way, and you'd like them to continue. That's fair. But I've been here 6 hours, and I'm still learning what's in the pantry and where things are kept. So tonight we have cornbread, and tomorrow we'll have biscuits, and after about a week, you won't remember what you were bothered about." She looked at him steadily. "Does that work for you?" Cord opened his mouth, closed it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Walt put his face briefly in his hand. Davy Hatch looked like he might actually start laughing. Ramon ate his beans. Ethan said nothing, but when he reached for the cornbread, there was something around the edges of his expression that might have been satisfaction. Come. Later that night, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and Ethan had done his last check on the horses, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with the account register open in front of her and a piece of paper where she'd been making notes. The kitchen was quiet. A lamp burned low. Outside, the mountain dark was profound, different from valley dark. Thicker, more complete, the kind of dark that made a person aware of how small and specific the lit space was against everything surrounding it. She heard the front door, bootsteps. Ethan appeared in the kitchen doorway. "You should sleep," he said. "I want to finish these." She didn't look up. "You've been paying Garrett's Mill 11 cents per pound over market rate for your grain supply. If you switch to Peterson's in Crestfield, you save about $40 a year. That's not nothing." He came in and looked at the paper over her shoulder. Not close, not invasive, just close enough to see what she was looking at. "Peterson's is 8 miles further," he said. "Once a month trip. The fuel costs less than the overpayment." She turned the page. Also, you've been buying all your salt pork from one supplier. If you split the order, Abigail. She stopped. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the register, then at her. You've been here one day, he said. I know. You found more in that register than I've noticed in 2 years. You're good with cattle and land, she said. You're not as good with accounts. That's not a criticism. It's just different skills. He was quiet again. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from somewhere. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Your father. Did he tell you anything about what he expected from this arrangement? On your end. She set down her pencil. He told me you needed a wife. He told me I needed a home. He told me that was all it was. And what do you think it is? She looked at him directly. She'd learned a long time ago that the women who got taken advantage of were usually the ones who looked away at the wrong moments. I think it's a working arrangement between two people who need different things, she said. I need a place where my skills are valued and where I'm not someone's burden. You need someone to run the part of this operation that isn't cattle and fences. If we can both get what we actually need, that seems like a reasonable foundation for something. He nodded slowly. And if it doesn't work, he said, if you get here and decide it ain't what you wanted, then I'll tell you honestly, and we'll figure out what comes next. She picked up her pencil. I don't run from things, Ethan. I've never had that luxury. But I don't stay where I'm not wanted either. He was quiet for a long moment. You're wanted here, he said, and his voice was level and plain without any particular softness or performance, just a fact stated as a fact. Something loosened in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. She didn't let him see it. Good, she said, and turned back to the register. He stayed at the table for a few more minutes, not talking, just present in the particular way of a man who doesn't feel the need to fill silence. Then he got up, said, "Good night," and went to bed. Abigail worked until the lamp needed trimming. When she finally climbed the stairs to the small room at the end of the hall, narrow bed, clean quilt, a window that looked out over the night mountain. She sat on the edge of the mattress and took her mother's kerchief out of her pocket and held it in both hands. She thought about her father's face when he'd told her she was a problem he was finished carrying. She thought about Ethan Cole sitting across a kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night, listening to her talk about grain prices like it was the most natural thing in the world. She thought about the gate she'd walked through with a trunk her father hadn't bothered to help her load. She pressed the kerchief to the inside of her wrist where she could feel her own pulse. Still here, she thought, still standing. She folded the kerchief, set it on the nightstand, and lay down. Outside the mountain, dark pressed against the window, full and deep and strangely safe. She slept better than she had in years. The morning started before sunrise. Abigail heard the boots on the porch at 4:30 and was already dressed by the time she heard the water pump handle squeak in the yard. She'd always been an early riser in her father's house. Early morning was the only time that belonged entirely to her before the demands of everyone else crowded in and claimed the day. She'd learned to protect those first hours like they were the only honest currency she owned. She had the fire going in the stove and the coffee on before Ethan came in from the yard, and she watched his face when he stepped through the kitchen door and registered the smell of it, that involuntary pause, that slight loosening around the eyes that people do when something small and good happens that they weren't expecting. You don't have to start this early, he said. I know. She set a mug on the table. I wanted to. He sat down and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment, and something in the way he did it told her this was a man who had been doing things alone for a long time. Not dramatically alone, not bitterly alone, just quietly, persistently alone, in the way that becomes so familiar it stops feeling like a condition and starts feeling like the shape of your life. She poured her own coffee and stood at the kitchen window. What time do the hands start? She asked. Walt and Ramon are already up, Cord and Davy by 5. Do they eat before or after the morning check? They've been eating after. He drank his coffee. Taking 2 hours before they get to it because there's nothing to come back for. She turned from the window. They'll eat at 5:30. Before. It's faster, and they'll work better. He looked at her over the rim of his mug. You're reorganizing my morning. I'm reorganizing the waste in your morning. She pulled bread from the bread box and set a pan on the stove. There's a difference. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he looked back down at his coffee. Yes, ma'am, he said. And that was the beginning of the second day at Painted Ridge Ranch. By the end of the first week, the kitchen had been transformed in ways the men couldn't entirely explain, but could feel in their bones. The meals were better, not fancier, just more deliberate, the kind of cooking that understood what a man needed after 6 hours of physical labor versus what he needed first thing in the morning. The supply list had been rewritten. The account ledger had 3 pages of Abigail's neat, compact handwriting inserted between Ethan's broader, less organized entries. Walt noticed her going through the root cellar on Wednesday morning with a lamp and a piece of paper. What are you looking for? He asked. Evidence of the mouse problem you've been ignoring, she said without looking up from her paper. Walt was quiet. The grain sacks on the lower shelf have been chewed at the bottom corners, she said. The burlap's been disturbed on the salt supply. You've lost maybe 8-10 pounds of cornmeal in the last month. That's not a big number, but it adds up. And more importantly, it means there are nesting sites in here somewhere, and if you don't address them before winter, you'll lose significantly more. Walt leaned against the doorframe. Ramon mentioned something about it in the spring. Then in the spring, someone should have set traps. We're busy in the spring. You're busy in every season, she said pleasantly. That's why you need systems that run without your constant attention. She folded her paper. I'll set the traps this afternoon. Do you have any, or do I need to put them on the supply order? Walt looked at her with an expression that was equal parts respect and wariness, which she'd come to recognize as his standard mode of dealing with new information. We have some in the equipment shed, he said. Good. She handed him the lamp and walked past him out of the cellar. Thank you, Walt. He stood in the doorway for a moment holding the lamp. You're welcome, he said to no one in particular, because she was already gone. The first real conflict came on Thursday. Cord Hatch had a habit of leaving his equipment where he dropped it at the end of the day, saddle over the fence rail tools on the ground beside the barn, rope looped around whatever post was nearest when he was done with it. In a working ranch, this wasn't unusual, but it was the kind of small disorder that accumulated into larger problems, and Abigail had watched it for 4 days and decided that Thursday was the day she was going to say something. She found him in the yard after the midday meal. Cord? He turned around, relaxed and unsuspecting. Yes, ma'am? Your saddle's been on the south fence rail for 3 days. He glanced toward the rail. I know where it is. It's been in direct afternoon sun for 3 days. The leather on the left shoulder is starting to dry and crack. That saddle cost your employer money, and it'll cost him more to replace or repair it. She kept her tone even. Put it in the tack room when you're done with it. Cord's jaw shifted slightly. He was young enough to feel the particular sting of being corrected by a woman in front of the ranch, but smart enough to know that what she'd said wasn't wrong. He glanced toward the barn where Davy was watching from the shadows with poorly concealed interest. I'll get to it, Cord said. Get to it now, she said. Please. The please was the most dangerous part. It left him no room to be offended without sounding like a child, which was entirely intentional. He got to it. Davy disappeared back into the barn before Cord could catch him watching. Ramon, who had been doing something complicated with a length of tack near the water trough, glanced up briefly at Abigail with dark, quiet eyes that said, I see you, and then looked back down at his work. That evening, Walt told Ethan what had happened. She's running the yard, Walt said. She's managing the equipment, Ethan said. That's the same thing. Not exactly. Ethan was leaning against the barn wall, watching the last light fade off the mountain. She's not telling anyone what to do with their time. She's telling them to take care of what belongs to this ranch. Walt studied him. You're all right with it. I'm all right with it. He straightened up. Cord needed to hear it. The saddle did need to go in the tack room. She was right, and she handled it without making him feel like a fool any longer than necessary. He looked at Walt. That's not nothing. A lot of people don't know how to do that. Walt was quiet for a moment. She's sharper than I expected, he said. Yes, Ethan agreed. She is. He didn't say anything else about it, but that night he came into the kitchen while she was finishing the accounts and set a piece of paper on the table beside her, a list of small repairs around the ranch property that he'd been meaning to address. In order of importance, he said, if you want to know where we stand. She picked it up and read through it. The water supply to the north pasture trough, she said. That should be first, not fifth. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Why? Because it's July and it'll be August before you know it, and if that line goes dry with cattle in the north pasture, you'll lose weight on the herd, you won't recover before fall. She set the paper down. Everything else on this list is a maintenance problem. That one is a money problem. He looked at her for a moment. When did you learn cattle management? He asked. I grew up on a farm. Your father's farm. Yes. He let you learn that side of it? She was quiet for a beat. He didn't know I was learning it. I paid attention when the men talked. I read what I could find. I watched. She picked up her pencil. There weren't a lot of people lining up to teach me things, so I taught myself. The kitchen was quiet. The fire crackled. That must have been lonely, he said. It wasn't what she expected him to say. She'd expected something practical, a follow-up question about the water line, a note about the herd. Not that. She kept her eyes on the ledger. I was used to it. Used to something doesn't mean it was all right. She looked up then. He was watching her with those dark, steady eyes, and there was no pity in them. That was the thing that caught her off guard. Most people who said kind things to her did it with a particular quality of pity underneath that made the kindness feel like charity. This was different. This was just a man stating what he believed to be true. No, she said after a moment. I suppose it doesn't. He nodded once and looked at the paper. I'll start on the north water line tomorrow. She looked back at the ledger. The lamp burned between them. The second week, Victor Blackwell came to call. She heard the horse before she heard the knock. A big animal well-shod, moving with the particular confidence of a horse whose owner had never in his life needed to worry about the cost of shoes. She was in the front room when the knock came, and she answered the door before she thought to wonder if she should, and found herself looking at a man who was not what she expected. Victor Blackwell was somewhere between 50 and 55, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and was now merely impressive, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, dressed in clothes that were expensive in a way that was intended to be noticed. He had the smile of a man who'd spent decades in rooms where people needed things from him, and he'd put it on so many times that it had stopped being a choice and become a reflex. He looked at Abigail and the smile adjusted slightly. Recalibrated. Good morning, he said. I'm looking for Ethan Cole. He's in the north pasture, she said. I can send someone. And you are. His tone was courteous. Curious in a way that wasn't entirely courteous. Abigail Cole, she said. The name came out before she'd decided to say it. She heard it herself and felt a small shock at how naturally it had arrived. Blackwell's expression moved through something she couldn't quite read and landed back on the impressive smile. His wife? His partner in this operation, she said. Would you like to wait, Mr. Blackwell? Victor Blackwell. I own the Blackwell mining interest in the next valley. He glanced past her into the front room with the practiced casualness of a man assessing property. I'll wait, thank you. She did not invite him inside. I'll have someone fetch Ethan, she said, and smiled with all the warmth of a woman who has learned that the most powerful thing you can do to a man like Victor Blackwell is be entirely pleasant while giving him absolutely nothing. She closed the door to the width of a respectful conversation and went to find Ramon. Yeah, Ethan came down from the north pasture with dirt on his hands and sweat on his shirt, and the particular expression of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of something important by something he's been expecting and would have preferred to put off longer. Abigail watched from the kitchen window as the two men stood on the porch and talked. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language. Blackwell expansive, taking up space, gesturing toward the mountain with a kind of proprietary confidence. Ethan still contained hands at his sides. Not aggressive, not deferential, just present in the way of a man who is standing on his own land and knows it. The conversation lasted about 15 minutes. When it ended, Blackwell tipped his hat at the door, not at Ethan, which told her something, and rode back down the road. Ethan came inside. He poured himself water from the pitcher on the kitchen table and drank it and set it down and looked at her. "What did he want?" she asked. "What he's wanted for 4 years. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. "The East Ridge. There's water under it. He wants to run a supply line to his mining operation. And if you sell, I don't sell the East Ridge. The East Ridge is where the spring feeds from. If I sell that, I lose the water rights to the upper pasture within 3 years. He looked at the table. He knows that. Then why does he keep asking? Ethan was quiet. Because 4 years ago, when my first bad winter hit, and I couldn't make the bank payment, he was the one who covered it. He looked at her steadily. I paid it back with interest. Every penny. But he's been using it as a conversation ever since. The kitchen went still. He thinks you owe him, she said. He thinks I remember that he could have let me fail. Ethan's jaw set. There's a difference. To you, not necessarily to him. He looked at her. It was the kind of look that came from someone recognizing that you'd just said the exact true thing they'd been trying not to look at directly. No, he said. Not to him. She sat down across from him and folded her hands on the table. Does he have anything on paper? She asked. The loan was repaid with documentation. Everything's clean. Then he has social leverage, which is real but not legal. She thought for a moment. What does he actually want, not the ridge? What does he want that the ridge represents? Ethan studied her. What do you mean? Men like Victor Blackwell don't need water access. They need to not be told no. The ridge is a test. She met his eyes. He's finding out whether you can still be managed. Ethan was very still. How do you know men like Victor Blackwell? He asked. My father owed money to one when I was 12, she said. I watched what happened. I paid attention. She pressed her lips together for a moment. He'll come back. And when he does, he'll bring something bigger. That's how it works. Ethan looked at the table for a long moment. I know, he said. Do you have documentation of everything? Deeds water rights, the original land grant. In the box in the study. I haven't looked at it in 2 years. She stood up. Then we should look at it, tonight, before he comes back with something you haven't prepared for. He looked up at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen yet. Not quite surprise, but close to it. The look of a man who has been carrying something alone for so long that the offer of another set of hands on it actually catches him off guard. All right, he said. They spent 2 hours in the study that evening, going through the wooden box that held the legal foundation of Painted Ridge Ranch. Ethan pulled documents out one by one, and Abigail read them and sorted them and asked questions, and he answered, and they built between them a clear picture of what he owned, and on what terms, and what was protected, and what was not. This water rights certificate, she said, holding up a folded document. Is this registered with the county? It should be. It was registered when I filed the original claim. Should be and are different. She set it aside. We need to confirm it's in the county record. If it's not on file, Blackwell's lawyers can challenge the claim even if you have the original document. Ethan looked at it. When did you learn land law? I didn't, but I know that a document only means what it can be proven to mean. She set it in the confirm pile. We need someone to look at these. A lawyer, not a banker. There's a man in Ridgeline, Carson. Is he honest? Ethan considered. Honest enough that Blackwell hasn't bought him yet. Then we go to Ridgeline at the end of the week." He was quiet for a moment. "You said we," he said. She looked up from the papers. He wasn't making a point of it. He wasn't trying to catch her at something. His voice was simply even and careful the way it was when he was paying close attention to something. "I did," she said. "You don't have to. I know what I have to and don't have to do, Ethan." She kept her voice level. "This ranch is where I live. What threatens it threatens me. That makes it my problem, too." She held his gaze. "Unless you'd prefer to handle it alone." He looked at her for a long, still moment. "No," he said quietly. "I wouldn't." The hands noticed the change before they could name it. It was Walt who put it to words on a Friday evening when the week's work was done, and the four men were sitting outside the bunkhouse in the cooling air. He didn't say it to Cord or Davy, who were young enough to take things at face value. He said it to Ramon, who was mending tack in the manner of a man who had learned to fill his hands while his mind was elsewhere. "Something's different," Walt said. Ramon didn't look up. "Yes, the ranch feels different." "Yes." She did that. Ramon glanced up briefly, with the specific expression of a man confirming something he'd already fully processed. "Yes," he said again, and looked back down at the tack. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's different too." Ramon set down the mending and looked at the far mountain. "A man who has been doing everything alone," Ramon said. "Starts to forget what it feels like to be heard." He picked up the tack again. "He remembers when someone listens." Walt absorbed this. "She's only been here 2 weeks," he said. "Some things don't take long to recognize," Ramon said. "It's the admitting that takes time." The trouble with Cord came on Saturday. It wasn't a mean thing. Cord Hatch wasn't a mean man. But he was 23 and from Texas, and had grown up in a world with a very specific understanding of what women were for and where they belonged in the order of a working ranch, and 2 weeks of having those understandings quietly dismantled had left a pressure in him that was looking for somewhere to go. He found it when Abigail went to the barn. She'd gone to check on a mare that had been moving stiffly for 2 days. She'd noticed it at morning feeding and mentioned it to Ethan, who'd said he'd look at it when he had time, which she translated as he was aware of it, but had 14 other things pulling at him. So she went herself with the small kit of remedies she'd brought from her father's farm. Comfrey root calendula, a poultice recipe she'd learned from an old woman in the valley who'd known more about horses than any veterinarian she'd ever encountered. She was in the stall running her hands along the mare's left foreleg when Cord came in. "What are you doing?" he said. "Checking her leg. She's been favoring it." "That's Ethan's horse." "I know whose horse it is." He crossed his arms. "Maybe you should let Ethan look at it. Ethan is in the north pasture replacing a fence line. This needs to be looked at today." She found the heat she was looking for just above the knee, and the mare shifted, and Abigail steadied her with a quiet hand and a softer sound. "She's got early inflammation here. If it's not treated, it'll stiffen into something that takes weeks to recover." "You're not a horse doctor." "Neither are you." She looked at him over the mare's neck. "I know what I'm doing, Cord. You've been here 2 weeks. I've been working with horses since I was 9 years old." Her voice was steady, not sharp. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you what I found and what I'm doing about it. If you want to tell Ethan I was in here, go ahead. He can come see for himself when he gets back." Cord stood in the barn doorway for another moment. Then Ramon appeared behind him, not dramatically just there, suddenly the way Ramon was, sometimes there when things needed a witness. "Is there a problem?" Ramon asked pleasantly. Cord looked at Ramon, then at Abigail, then back at Ramon. "No," he said, and left. Ramon came to the stall and looked in at what she was doing. Abigail kept working. The mare stood still under her hands, which was its own kind of answer. "The left foreleg," Ramon said, "just above the knee. Heat and minor swelling. She probably caught it on something. Ramon watched for a moment. What are you using? Comfrey poultice. Draw the inflammation, then I'll wrap it and check it tomorrow morning. He was quiet for a moment. My grandmother used comfrey, he said. For horses and for people both. It's good for both, she said. He handed her a length of clean bandage from the shelf above the stall without being asked. Thank you, she said. He tipped his head slightly in that way of his and stepped back to let her work. When Ethan came in from the north pasture late that afternoon, he went to the barn. First habit, always the barn before the house, and found the mare in her stall with a clean poultice wrap on her left foreleg, and fresh water in her bucket, and the smell of calendula faint in the stall air. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. Then he came inside. Abigail was at the kitchen table writing. She heard his boots and didn't look up. She was favoring the left foreleg this morning. She said, "Early inflammation. I put a poultice on it. She should be checked tomorrow morning, but I think she'll be fine." He didn't say anything. She looked up. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, with his hat in his hands, looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated than gratitude, the look of a man who has just understood something he hadn't understood before. "Thank you," he said. "It needed doing." Abigail. She set down her pencil. "I've been running this ranch alone for 16 years, he said. "I've managed because I had to, but there are things I miss because I'm in 15 places at once." He paused. "My horse's leg was one of them today." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to do less," he said. I'm saying. He stopped, which was unusual because Ethan Cole was a man who said what he meant and didn't usually run out of road in the middle of it. "I'm saying thank you for doing the thing I didn't get to." She looked at him for a long moment. "You can just say thank you," she said. "You don't have to explain it." "I know, I wanted to explain it." "Why?" He was quiet. "Because I want you to know it matters," he said. "What you do here, it matters." The kitchen was very still. She'd heard those words before, variations of them from her father's neighbors, who praised her cooking at church suppers from her brothers, when they needed something from the world, in that particular selective way, where a woman's usefulness was acknowledged specifically when it was being extracted. But she had never heard them the way Ethan Cole said them, which was simply true. No extraction attached, no condition behind it. She picked up her pencil. "We need to be in Ridgeline by Thursday," she said, and her voice was entirely steady. "To see Carson about the water rights documentation." He put his hat back on. "Thursday." He agreed. He went to wash up, and she turned back to her writing, and neither of them said anything else. But when supper was ready, and she set the food on the table, and the men filed in from the bunkhouse, and Ethan came from the back of the house, he held her chair for her before he sat down. Just that. Nothing said. Walt saw it. Ramon saw it. Cord and Davy were too busy reaching for the bread to notice. But she noticed. She sat down and unfolded her napkin and said, "The biscuits are better today." And Cord said, "Yes, ma'am, they are." And Davy laughed, and the supper table was loud for the first time since she'd arrived at Painted Ridge Ranch. Ethan ate his meal and didn't say much, which was usual for him. But once when the conversation got loud and she said something dry and quick that made Walt burst out laughing. Ethan glanced at her across the table with those dark eyes and the edge of something that was definitely, this time, a smile. She looked back at her plate. The lamp burned warm. Outside, the mountain dark pressed in around the house, but inside the kitchen it was bright and loud and full of the particular complicated life of people who are in the process of becoming, without anyone having quite announced it yet, a kind of family. And somewhere in the valley below, Victor Blackwell was writing a letter to his lawyers about the East Ridge water rights, and it was the 12th day of Abigail Turner's life at Painted Ridge Ranch, and she had not yet let herself think about what that might mean. But she held her mother's kerchief in her pocket on her way upstairs that night, and pressed it between her fingers, and thought almost involuntarily, I think I might want to stay. She held the thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then, she set it down as carefully as she set the lamp on the nightstand and went to sleep. Carson's office in Ridgeline smelled like old paper and tobacco, and the man himself looked exactly like someone who had spent 30 years reading documents. Other people didn't want read, small, precise, with the kind of eyes that moved across a page the way a hawk moves across a field. He spread Ethan's documents across his desk and didn't speak for a long time. Abigail sat beside Ethan and watched Carson's face and waited. She'd learned a long time ago that the most important information in any room came not from what people said, but from the half-second before they decided what to say. Carson's half-second told her everything. "The water rights certificate is filed correctly," he said. "It's in the county record. I checked before you arrived." He tapped the document with one finger. "But there's a problem." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What kind of problem?" "The boundary description on the original filing uses marker 11 as a reference point." Carson looked up. Marker 11 is a survey stake that was placed in 1871. In 1879, the county resurveyed this section of mountain, and the new stakes were placed approximately 40 feet east of the originals. Abigail went still. 40 feet east, she said. "Which means," Carson continued, "that depending on how a judge interprets the original filing, the boundary of your water rights claim could be read as starting 40 feet further east than you believe, which would place the source spring, not the water line, but the spring itself technically outside your protected claim." The office was very quiet. "Blackwell knows this," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "Blackwell's lawyers found it 6 months ago." Carson folded his hands on the desk. "I know because Henderson, who works for Blackwell, came in here asking about that exact survey discrepancy in March. I told him what I'm telling you now. He left without saying much." Abigail looked at Ethan. His jaw was set, his hands on his knees very still. She recognized that stillness now. It wasn't passivity. It was the deliberate containment of a man keeping himself level when the ground was moving under him. "What are our options?" she asked Carson. Carson looked at her. In the 2 weeks she'd been at Painted Ridge, she'd become very good at watching men decide how seriously to take her, and she watched Carson do it now, a brief calculation, and then the particular settling that came when a man decided the answer was seriously. "You can file a corrective amendment to the original claim," he said, speaking to both of them now. "Document that the spring was in continuous use and under your management since the original filing. Establish that the intent of the claim was always to include the spring, and request the boundary be interpreted consistent with that intent." He paused. "It's not a sure thing. It would require testimony from anyone who knew the land before 1879. It would require documentation of continuous use. And it would require filing before Blackwell's lawyers file their own challenge, which, based on what I know of Henderson, will happen within the next 30 to 60 days. How long do we have?" Ethan asked. "If you start gathering documentation this week, 2 weeks, maybe 3, to build a solid filing." Ethan looked at Abigail. She was already thinking. He could see it, that focused interior quality that her face got when she was building something in her mind. He'd noticed it in the kitchen, over the ledgers in the study with the documents. She didn't perform thinking. She just did it. "Who would know the land before 1879? She asked Carson. "Old Walt Briggs was working this territory as a surveyor's assistant in the early 70s, Carson said. He'd have knowledge of the original stake placement." A pause. "And there's a Ute elder named Joseph Redhawk, who's been in this valley longer than any record we have. He'd know where the spring was and how it's been used. A federal judge will wait his testimony." Ethan stood up. "Then that's where we start." He extended his hand to Carson. They shook. Carson looked at Abigail. "Ma'am," he said with something in his voice that was close to respect. "You asked the right questions." "We asked them together," she said. She stood and walked out, and Ethan held the door, and neither of them spoke until they were back in the wagon and the town of Ridgeline was falling away behind them and the mountain road was rising up ahead. Then Ethan said, "I didn't know about the survey discrepancy." "I know." If you hadn't pushed for us to come to Carson. Don't. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. We're not doing that. Abigail. We found it in time, she said. That's what matters. What happens next is what we do about it. He was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. She heard something in that not just agreement, something deeper, something that was still settling into shape. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the mountain. Walt was not technically a surveyor anymore, but he remembered things the way old men remember the work that shaped them in his hands and his feet, in the specific muscle memory of walking land and reading it. When Ethan explained what they needed, Walt sat with it for a long, thoughtful moment, and then he said, I was with the crew that placed Marker 11, summer of 1871. I was 19 years old. You remember it? Abigail asked. I remember it because the foreman argued with the lead surveyor about the placement for 2 hours in the July heat, and I was the one holding the equipment. Walt looked at her. The spring was on your side of that marker, I'm sure of it. The foreman wanted it further east because he thought the terrain would complicate the line, but the surveyor insisted on the correct position. He paused. I can write that down. I can say it under oath. We may need you to, Ethan said. Walt looked between them. This is Blackwell. Yes. How bad? Bad enough that we need to move fast, Abigail said. Walt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I've been on this ranch for 12 years, Ethan. You took me on when no one else would because I was old and my back was giving out. And you said you needed experience more than you needed speed. He looked at Ethan directly. You tell me what you need. I'll do it. Ethan gripped the old man's shoulder for a moment. Said nothing. Didn't need to. Abigail looked at them both and felt something she hadn't expected. Not sentiment exactly, but the recognition of something real. These were people who stayed, who meant what they said. She'd grown up in a house where words meant approximately nothing, where promises were made the way weather was made without intention, without accountability. She'd learned to expect nothing and be grateful for less. She was still learning in the slow and cautious way of someone who's been burned that some things were actually what they appeared to be. Finding Joseph Redhawk took 2 days. He wasn't hiding. He simply lived the way he'd always lived, which was on his own terms in the high country above the main valley, in a place that required effort to reach and offered nothing to people who came for the wrong reasons. He was a tall man, somewhere past 70, with the particular stillness of someone who had outlasted a great many things that were supposed to outlast him. He looked at Abigail first when Ethan introduced them, and his assessment was unhurried and complete. You're the woman from the valley, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I am, she said. Harlan Turner's daughter. She was quiet for a moment. You know my father. I know the land your father farmed for 20 years without ever learning to read it. He looked at her steadily. You read it. I've seen you walking the north pasture. She hadn't known anyone was watching. You know what we need, Ethan said. Redhawk looked at him. I know what you need. I know why you need it. He turned and walked toward the small fire at the center of the space, and they followed. Blackwell has been moving toward that spring for 3 years. He started with the roads, then the mining access, now the water. He sat down. He won't stop at the spring. What does he want if it's not just the spring? Abigail asked. Redhawk looked at her with something that might have been approval. He wants the high mountain water system. The spring feeds 3 ranches and 2 streams that communities use for farming. If he controls the spring, he controls the access. And in a dry summer, access is everything. Ethan's jaw tightened. That's not in any document. No, Redhawk said. It wouldn't be. Men like Blackwell don't write down the real thing. They write down the step before the real thing. Abigail thought about Blackwell standing on Ethan's porch, his eyes moving across the property like he was already measuring it. Will you testify? She asked. Redhawk was quiet for a moment. I will tell the truth about that spring and what it has been since before any marker was placed. What a judge does with that truth is not my responsibility." "That's all we're asking," she said. He looked at her again, that same long, unhurried assessment. "Your father," he said. "Does he know what he gave away when he sent you up here?" She held his gaze. "No, he doesn't." Red Hawk was quiet. "Good," he said finally, and the word carried something in it she didn't entirely understand, but felt somewhere old and deep. Some men should have to live with not knowing. Gemmed. They were 3 days into building the documentation when the first writer came from Blackwell. Not Blackwell himself. A man named Tully, who worked as a kind of general agent for the Blackwell interests, mid-30s, flat-eyed with the professional pleasantness of someone who'd learned that being likable was a useful tool and had never confused it for being good. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday morning while Ethan was in the pasture and found Abigail in the yard. "Mrs. Cole," he said, pleasant as sunlight. She looked at him and didn't say anything. "Mr. Blackwell asked me to extend an invitation," Tully said. "He'd like to have dinner with you and your husband at the Ridgeline Hotel on Friday evening. He has a proposal he believes would benefit all parties." "All parties," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "That's a generous framing," Tully smiled. "Mr. Blackwell is a generous man." She looked at him steadily. "Tell Mr. Blackwell that we appreciate the invitation, but will need to decline for now. We have a great deal of work to get done before the weather changes." Tully's pleasant expression held. "Mr. Blackwell did ask me to mention specifically that his proposal involves a financial arrangement that would substantially reduce the pressure that ranch operations sometimes put on a family." The word family landed with the particular weight of a word chosen carefully by someone who knew exactly what weight it would carry. She smiled at Tully with all the warmth she had available. "That's kind," she said. "But we're all right. Give Mr. Blackwell our regards." Tully held for a moment, reassessing. "He'll be disappointed," he said. "I imagine he will," she said. "Good morning." She turned and walked back into the house, and she heard him stand in the yard for a moment before he left. She went to the study window and watched him ride back down the mountain road. Then she went to find Ramon, because Ramon was the kind of man who noticed things without being asked to, and she wanted to know if Tully had spoken to anyone else on the property before he came to her. Ramon was at the water trough. He looked up when she came toward him with that quiet, watchful expression of his. "The man who just left," she said. "Did he stop anywhere before he came to the house?" "He spoke to Cord," Ramon said. She absorbed that. "For how long?" 2-3 minutes, by the south fence." Ramon's expression was carefully neutral. Cord looked uncomfortable, but he listened. "Thank you," she said. She found Cord in the barn 20 minutes later. He was working, but not easily the kind of working where a person's hands are busy and their mind is somewhere else entirely. "Cord," she said. He turned around, and his face did the thing guilty faces do when they're trying not to look guilty, which was to look slightly too open. "Ma'am." She came into the barn and stopped several feet from him. She didn't crowd him. She didn't want him defensive, she wanted him honest. "What did Tully say to you?" she asked. Cord's jaw worked for a moment. "He asked how things were going up here," he said. "I said fine." "What else?" A pause. "He asked whether Ethan had been having any financial troubles, whether the ranch was, whether things were solid." "And what did you say?" "I said things were better than they had been." He looked at her. "I didn't say anything that wasn't true, and I didn't say anything bad. I didn't know who he was, and he was asking like it was just conversation." She looked at him for a long moment. "I believe you," she said. "But Cord men like that aren't making conversation. Every question they ask goes somewhere. Anything you said about this ranch, about our finances, about any trouble we've been having, he took that back to Blackwell." Cord's face changed. "I didn't tell him anything secret." "I know, but pay attention." She held his gaze. "If anyone comes to this ranch asking questions about our business, and Ethan isn't here, you come find me before you answer. Even if it seems like nothing. Especially if it seems like nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and this time there was something genuine in it that hadn't been there the first week. She turned to leave. "Miss Abigail," he said. She stopped. "I didn't mean to mess up," Cord said. She looked back at him. He was young. He was genuinely sorry. And he had good hands and a decent heart, and the great disadvantage of not yet knowing how the world worked. "You didn't mess up," she said. "You're learning. There's a difference." She walked out. Petite. That night she told Ethan. All of it, Tully's visit, the message about Blackwell's dinner invitation, and what Ramon had seen and what Cord had said. She told him in the study with the documents spread between them on the desk, and she watched his face go through the sequence of a man absorbing information that was worse than he'd expected. "He's probing," Ethan said. "Yes, he sent Tully to test whether we'd accept the social overture, and at the same time, he used Tully to gather information from the hands." She paused. "He's building a picture of how vulnerable we are. And are we?" He looked at her directly. "Financially, honestly." She'd gone through the accounts 3 times since coming to Painted Ridge. She knew every number. "We're not in trouble," she said. "We're not comfortable, but we're not in trouble. The feed cost savings, the new supplier for the salt pork, the reduction in the grain overpayment, those things together buy us room." She held his gaze. "But if Blackwell gets a legal challenge filed before we get the corrective amendment in the cost of fighting it, would hurt us badly." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "How long have you been carrying all of that by yourself?" he asked. "Carrying what?" "The numbers, the accounts, the planning." He looked at the desk between them. "How long have you been tracking all of it without knowing whether I was even paying attention?" She looked at him carefully. "Since the 3rd day," she said. "I've been paying attention," he said. "I want you to know that. Everything you've done, I see it. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I'm not going to start now." Something moved in her chest. Not sentimentality. Something older and more careful than that. The recognition of being witnessed by someone who wasn't asking anything for the witnessing. "I know you see it," she said. "Do you?" She held his gaze for a moment. "I'm starting to." The lamp burned low between them. Outside, the mountain was very still. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. When I wrote that letter to your father and the other families, I wrote it because I needed help with the ranch. That's true, but I want to be honest with you about something I wasn't honest with myself about at the time." He looked at the desk, then back at her. "I've been alone on this mountain for a long time, and I told myself that was fine, that it was what I wanted, that I didn't need anything beyond the work and the land." A pause. "I was wrong about that. I just didn't know how wrong until you were in my kitchen at 4:30 in the morning with coffee made before I'd even gotten to the pump." She didn't look away. "Ethan, I'm not asking you for anything," he said immediately. "I'm not putting that on you. You've been honest with me from the first day, and I owe you the same. That's all." She pressed her lips together for a moment. "I'm afraid," she said, and the words came out more quietly than she'd planned. He was very still. "Of what?" "Of deciding I want something and being wrong about it." She looked at her own hands on the desk. "I've been wrong about what was safe before. I've trusted what looked solid and had it give way." She looked up at him. "I don't want to do that here. I need to be sure." "That's fair," he said. "You're not going to tell me I shouldn't be afraid?" "No." His voice was even and certain. "You've got every reason to take your time. I'm not going anywhere." The simplicity of it hit her differently than any elaborate reassurance could have. She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet, steady man on his mountain with his horse and his documents and his hands that fixed things before they had to be broken, and she thought, "I am in a great deal of trouble, and it has nothing to do with Victor Blackwell." "We should sleep," she said. "We need to get Walt's testimony written before Saturday." Yes, he said. He stood, and she stood, and they gathered the documents and put them in the box. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. But when she turned toward the door, he said her name once quietly. Abigail. She turned. Thank you, he said, for being the kind of person who stays. She held that for exactly as long as it took her to breathe in and breathe out. Good night, Ethan, she said. She climbed the stairs and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her mother's kerchief against her mouth for a moment, not crying, just feeling the full weight of something she hadn't let herself feel in years, which was the terrifying possibility of hope. The storm came on a Thursday, 6 days before they planned to file. It came the way mountain summer storms come, without much warning, the sky shifting in the early afternoon from blue to the particular yellow-gray that Walt called meaning business, and then the wind, and then the thunder rolling down from the high peaks like something that had been holding off as long as it could. By 3 o'clock the rain was coming sideways. Ethan was already pulling men in from the pastures. Abigail was in the kitchen when she heard the first crash from outside, not thunder, something structural. She went to the window and saw the roof of the feed storage leaning at an angle it had never leaned before. She pulled on her coat and went outside without stopping to think about it. The rain hit her like a wall. She crossed the yard with her head down, reached the feed storage, and saw immediately what had happened. The east support beam had given way. The one that she had noticed in her first week was slightly soft at the base, and had put on her mental list of things to address, and had not yet gotten to, because there were 40 other things. The roof was halfway down. Inside, 50-pound sacks of grain were absorbing the rain by the second. She grabbed the nearest sack and dragged it toward the door. Abigail! Ethan's voice right behind her, sharp with alarm. The grain, she said. It'll be ruined. Get out from under that. Help me move it. Ethan, we don't have time. He grabbed a sack from the other side, and they moved it together, and then Cord was there, and Davy and Ramon, all of them pulling feed sacks out into the rain and stacking them against the barn wall, working fast and without much talking, because there wasn't time for talking. The roof groaned. Everyone out. Ethan's voice was absolute. Now. Out. They got out. The roof came down 2 seconds later with a sound like something final, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been going on too long. They stood in the rain, looking at what was left. Abigail counted sacks. 37, out of 62. 25 in the wreckage. Ethan was standing beside her. Both of them soaked through. The rain was still driving sideways, and the thunder was something you felt in your chest. 25 sacks, she said. I know. If we don't replace them before the end of the week. I know. His voice wasn't harsh, just tight. I know, Abigail. She looked at him. His face was wet and set, and she could see him doing the math. She was doing the cost of the lost feed, the cost of replacement, the cost of repairing or rebuilding the storage, the cost of that against everything else they were managing right now. We can do it, she said. He looked at her. The money is tight, but not broken. She held his gaze through the rain. I know where we are. I've known where we are for 3 weeks. We can absorb this. He looked at her for a long moment. Then Walt shouted from across the yard. Ethan! Walt's voice was strange, not panicked, but carrying something that made everyone turn. The cattle in the north pasture. Gates open. The gate. The north pasture gate, which Davy had gone to check that morning and reported as secure, which had apparently not been as secure as reported, and 60 head of cattle were now somewhere on the mountain in a summer storm. Ethan was already moving. Cord, Davy, saddle up. He turned to Abigail. Stay at the ranch. I know the north pasture better than Cord does, she said. I've walked every inch of it. Abigail, I'm not arguing with you, Ethan. I'm stating a fact. She met his eyes. Let me help. Something moved through his face, the conflict of a man who wanted to protect someone and was being clearly and calmly told that protection was not what was needed right now. He handed her a slicker from the barn wall. Stay with Ramon, he said. Don't go above the tree line alone. Agreed, she said. They rode out into the storm. The cattle had scattered east, which Abigail had expected. Animals in storms always ran with the wind at their backs, and the wind was coming from the west. She knew there was a natural funnel between the two ridge lines, about half a mile into the north pasture, a narrowing of the terrain, where animals tended to collect because it felt safer. She told Ramon. He listened without interrupting. "You've been up there?" he asked. "3 times, in the first week." She'd walked the pasture in the early mornings when the ranch was still quiet. She'd wanted to understand the land she was managing accounts for. The funnel is real. If they went east, they're there. Ramon looked at her for a moment. "Lead," he said. She led. They found the cattle, not all of them, but most of them, 41 head pressed together in exactly the natural funnel she'd described, miserable in the rain, but contained by the terrain on 3 sides. Ramon got them moving south, while Abigail flanked the far edge, and within 40 minutes they were pushing the herd back down toward the ranch in the steadying rain. Ethan was coming back from the west ridge with Cord and Davy and 12 more cattle when he saw her and Ramon coming down the slope with 41. He pulled his horse up and looked at her through the rain. She rode past him with the herd moving around them both, and she said without stopping, "Natural funnel between the ridge lines. Animals go east in a west wind. It's in the terrain." She heard him behind her. "How did you know that?" "I walked every inch of your north pasture in the first week," she called back. "I told you I was learning the land." She didn't see his face, but she heard Cord say something to Davy behind her, and Davy make a sound that was definitely awe, and she kept riding. By the time they got back to the ranch, the storm was moving east, the way mountain storms do when they've said what they came to say. The yard was a mess, mud-scattered equipment, the collapsed feed storage a wet heap against the barn. Walt was already at the wreckage assessing. Ramon started on the cattle. Cord and Davy saw to the horses. Ethan dismounted and walked toward her. She was still on her horse. She was soaked completely through, her hair plastered against her face, her coat heavy with water. She probably looked like something the storm had dragged in. He reached up. She put her hand in his and stepped down from the horse, and he held her hand for exactly 1 second longer than was necessary to help her down and then let go. 53 out of 60, he said. The other 7 went west. They'll come in on their own when the weather clears. How do you know? Because the west side of the pasture has the only dry rock outcropping. They'll shelter there tonight and come home when they're hungry tomorrow. She looked at him steadily. The feed storage needs to be rebuilt before we can store anything in it. That's the priority after the cattle are secured. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was seeing something clearly that he'd been almost seeing for a while. "Abigail," he said. "I know," she said before he could say whatever he was going to say. "I know Ethan." She wasn't entirely sure what she knew, but she felt it the weight of the day. The storm, the cattle, his hand on hers for 1 extra second, the East Ridge and Blackwell and the corrective filing that was 6 days away, and the way this mountain had started to feel impossibly like somewhere she had always been going. Walt called out about the storage assessment, and Ethan turned, and the moment broke into the practical business of the aftermath of a storm. But Ramon caught her eye across the yard, and his expression said very quietly everything he never said out loud. She looked away before she had to decide what her own expression said. Inside the house, she changed her wet clothes and came back down and made coffee, and when the men came in cold and tired, the kitchen was warm and ready, and nobody said anything about what it meant that it was, but everyone felt it. And in the ridgeline valley below Henderson, Blackwell's lawyer was looking out a rain-streaked window, and beside him on the desk was a letter he had just finished drafting, a formal challenge to the Painted Ridge water rights claim, dated to file in 4 days. 4 days. Abigail didn't know that yet, but the storm had said something in its loud and indiscriminate way about what was coming. And in the kitchen of Painted Ridge Ranch, handing Ethan Cole a mug of coffee with both hands, she felt it in the particular way that women who have learned to read the world feel things coming, not in the words, not yet, but in the air, in the change of pressure, in the quality of the quiet after a storm when everything is still and waiting. And the next thing hasn't arrived yet, but is absolutely on its way. The 7 cattle came home the next morning exactly as Abigail said they would. Ethan was at the barn when they came in from the West Ridge, moving slow and hungry and complaining about it, and he counted them without expression and then stood there for a moment, looking at the place on the slope where they'd come from. She'd known. She'd walked the land in the first week and filed it away and known in the middle of a storm, with 41 head to move, where 7 more were sheltering, and what they'd do when they got hungry. He turned and walked back to the house. She was in the kitchen with the accounts open the way she was every morning. Coffee made the day's numbers already in her head before he'd finished the morning check. He came in and poured himself a mug and stood at the counter and looked at her. 7 came in, he said. I know. I watched from the window. She didn't look up from the ledger. Full count. Full count, he agreed. He drank his coffee. The filing, he said. 4 days. 3 days now. She turned a page. Walt finished his written testimony last night. I went through it this morning and it's solid. Carson will know what to do with it. And Red Hawk. Ramon is writing up to confirm he'll appear in person if it goes to a hearing. She finally looked up. It won't go to a hearing, Ethan. Not if we get the corrective amendment filed before Henderson moves. Carson said the county recorder is fair and follows the documentation. If our filing is clean and first a challenge becomes a much steeper hill for Blackwell's lawyers. He nodded. She could see the tension in him. Not panic, just the specific strain of a man holding multiple things at once, trying to keep each one from dropping while he handled the others. The feed storage, she said. Cord and Davy started on the frame this morning. Cost? Lumber from the mill in Ridgeline. About $30. I moved it from the contingency column last night. We have it. She held his gaze. We're all right. He looked at her for a moment in that direct, undecorated way he had. I know we are, he said. Because you've made us all right. She looked back at her ledger. We've made us all right. He set his mug on the counter. I need to tell you something, he said. And I'd like to say it before we get into another day where there's no room for it. She set her pencil down. The woman I am now, she said slowly, is not the woman my father sent up here. He stopped. I mean, I am, she said. I'm the same person. But I was when I came through that gate. I was someone who had spent so long being managed and overlooked and sent away that I'd stopped expecting anything to be different. She folded her hands on the table. I expected this to be another version of the same thing. I expected to work and be tolerated and be useful, and that would be enough. That was all I was hoping for. He was very still. And now, he said. Now I don't know what I'm hoping for, she said honestly, because what I'm hoping for has gotten considerably larger than I know what to do with. The kitchen was entirely quiet. Ethan Cole, who was not a man who moved quickly toward things, who took his time and said what he meant and meant what he said, walked the 3 steps from the counter to the table and pulled out the chair beside her, not across from her, beside her, and sat down. I know what I'm hoping for, he said. She looked at him. I'm hoping for this, he said, for you here, for what this ranch is becoming because you're in it, for the way it feels to come in from the pasture and know that there's someone who's been paying attention while I was gone. He met her eyes directly. I'm not rushing you. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now, but I'm not pretending I don't know what I feel just because it came faster than I expected. She looked at him for a long moment. You're not afraid of it, she asked. I'm terrified, he said. But I've been on this mountain alone for 16 years, and I know the difference between being afraid of something good and being afraid of something bad. He didn't look away. This is afraid of something good. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Give me time, she said. I already said I would. I know. I'm saying it back to you so you know I heard it. He almost smiled. There it was, that edge of something warm that moved across his face and was gone before it fully arrived. All right, he said. He stood up and picked up his hat and went back out to the ranch, and she turned back to the ledger, and her hands were not entirely steady on the pencil, and she did not examine that too closely. Henderson's filing arrived 2 days later. Not in Ridgeline, not through Carson. It arrived at the ranch itself, delivered by a young county clerk who looked genuinely uncomfortable about being the person delivering it, handed to Abigail at the front door on a Tuesday morning with an apologetic duck of his head. She read it standing in the doorway. It was a formal legal challenge to the Painted Ridge water rights claim, citing the 1879 survey discrepancy filed with the county records office the previous afternoon. Which meant Henderson had moved early. Which meant someone had told Blackwell that they were preparing a corrective filing. Which meant there was a source of information closer than they'd thought. She read it twice. Then she closed the door and went to find Ethan. He was in the barn. She walked in and handed him the document without preamble. He read it. His face didn't change much, but she'd learned his face well enough by now to see the tightening around his eyes that meant he was absorbing something significant. He moved early, Ethan said. 2 days early, which means he knew we were preparing something. Ethan looked at her. Cord, he said. I don't think it was cord, not intentionally. She'd thought about it for the 3 minutes it had taken her to walk from the house to the barn. Tully came back yesterday afternoon when you were in the south pasture. I didn't know until this morning. He spoke to Cord again just briefly at the fence line. Ethan was very still. What did Cord say? I don't know yet, but I can make a reasonable guess. She kept her voice level. Cord knew we were planning to go to Ridgeline Thursday. He wouldn't have thought twice about mentioning it if Tully asked casually. I told him, she said. And he tried. But Tully is professional and Cord is 23. She shook her head. This isn't Cord's fault. It's Blackwell being better at this game than we gave him credit for. Ethan handed the document back to her. He walked the length of the barn, turned around, walked back. It was the first time she'd seen him pace. We can still file the corrective amendment, she said. Carson told us the challenge doesn't automatically win. It just means it goes to the county records board for a determination. If our documentation is stronger than their challenge, we still prevail. How long does a determination take? Carson said 6 to 8 weeks. In the meantime, the water rights aren't transferred, they're just held pending review. And if the board rules against us, then it goes to a circuit court judge. She paused. But it won't. He looked at her. You're sure? I'm sure enough. She held the document up. Their filing cites the survey discrepancy. That's their only argument. We have Walt's testimony placing the original marker correctly, Red Hawk's testimony about continuous historical use, Carson's analysis of the original filing intent, and our documentation of 16 years of uncontested use. She lowered the document. Their argument is a technicality. Our argument is the truth. He looked at her for a long moment. When did you get so sure about all of this? He asked. About 48 hours ago, when I finished reading every word of the original water rights law that Carson gave me. She let that land, then said, We need to go to Ridgeline today. Not Thursday. Today. He grabbed his hat off the post. Ramon, he called toward the back of the barn. Ramon appeared from the far stall as though he'd been there all along. Get the wagon ready, Ethan said. Chin. Carson read the challenge filing in less than 5 minutes, which told Abigail that he'd been expecting something like it, and then he looked up over his reading spectacles with the expression of a man who is not surprised, but is nevertheless displeased. Henderson filed yesterday at 4 o'clock, Carson said. The challenge is technically valid but thin. They're relying entirely on the survey discrepancy and hoping you won't have documentation to counter it. We have the documentation, Abigail said. She set Walt's testimony on the desk, then the summary of Red Hawk's account, then her own written analysis of the continuous use record cross-referenced against the account's ledger. 16 years of uncontested water use, 2 eyewitness accounts of the original boundary, analysis of the filing intent. Carson picked up the documents one at a time. He read Walt's testimony. He read the Red Hawk summary. He read her analysis. He was quiet for a while. "This analysis," he said. "Who prepared it?" "I did," Abigail said. He looked at her over his spectacles again. "You cross-referenced the original survey law against the county amendment procedure. I read everything you gave Ethan. Then I read the county law index you have on that shelf behind your desk." She met his eyes. "The continuous use doctrine supersedes a survey technicality if the use has been open, uncontested, and documented for more than 10 years. We have 16. Henderson can file all he wants. The doctrine is on our side." Carson set the papers down. He looked at Ethan. "Where did you find her?" he said. "Her father sent her up the mountain," Ethan said. "Her father," Carson said with the tone of a man filing that information somewhere ironic, "made the best mistake of his life." He picked up his pen. "We'll file the corrective amendment today, concurrent with a continuous use declaration. I'll have the formal response to Henderson's challenge drafted by end of week." He looked at Abigail. "Your analysis goes in as a supporting exhibit. I'll format it to court standards." She nodded. "Will it hold?" Ethan asked. "It'll hold," Carson said. "Blackwell's lawyers are good, but they filed thin because they were rushing, and rushing is how good lawyers make bad arguments." He picked up the stack of documents. "Let me work." They left him to it. On the street outside Carson's office, Ethan stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He was looking at something across the street, not looking exactly. More like standing in the particular way of a man who has been holding his breath for 2 weeks and has just without quite deciding to let it out. "It's going to be all right," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "I knew it about an hour into watching you talk to Carson." "It's not settled yet." "No, but you know what you're doing." He looked at her steadily. "I knew what I was doing with cattle and land before you got here. Now I know the whole ranch. You made me know the whole ranch." He paused. "That's not something I take lightly." She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan," she said, and her voice was quieter than she'd planned. "I want you to know that. Whatever happens with Carson and Henderson and the county board, I'm not going anywhere." Something in him settled. She could see it. "All right," he said. They walked back to the wagon together. The news that Blackwell had filed a legal challenge against Painted Ridge's water rights moved through Ridgeline faster than Abigail expected, which told her that Blackwell had wanted it to move, that the filing was as much a social maneuver as a legal one, a public signal that the mountain ranch was vulnerable, that Ethan Cole was being challenged by someone with the resources to make challenges expensive. She understood this within 2 days of their return to the ranch, when a neighbor named Harold Pratt rode up the road to return a borrowed tool and lingered in the yard with the careful, apologetic manner of a man delivering bad news he hadn't asked to carry. "People are talking," Pratt said, turning his hat in his hands. He was a decent man, small farm, 2 valleys, over 3 kids, the kind of person who minded his own business until minding his own business felt like a choice he couldn't live with. "In town. They're saying Blackwell's lawyers have something real." "They don't," Abigail said. Pratt looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at her. "I'm not saying I believe it," he said quickly. "I'm saying that's what's going around. And that he's been talking, at the hotel at the bank, saying this water rights thing is going to settle something that's been unsettled for a long time." He shifted his weight. "He's got people thinking this might go his way. And if it does, Abigail said carefully, "what happens?" Pratt's jaw tightened. "He controls the spring, he controls the water table for 3 ranches and the Crestfield Farming Collective. He's made some suggestions already about what kind of access agreements might be available." He looked at the ground for a moment. "The Hendersons over on the east slope are already talking to his people. They're scared." Ethan crossed his arms. "He's been talking to the other ranches. While the legal thing is going on, yeah." Pratt met his eyes. "He's moving on 2 fronts, Ethan. Legal and social. If he gets enough people nervous enough, some of them will sign access agreements before the county board even rules. Then, even if you win the water rights, he's already got the other ranches locked in. The yard was very quiet. Abigail looked at the road. She was thinking. "How many ranches?" she asked. "4 in the direct water table, 7 more in the secondary. Which ones are still uncommitted?" Pratt thought. Brennan up on the North Fork, the Cahill family on the South Ridge, old Mrs. Wyeth, who's been there 40 years and doesn't trust anyone. He paused. And 2 smaller operations that rotate the Holt brothers and the Marcy place. She looked at Ethan. He was already looking at her. "We need to talk to them," she said. "We need to talk to them." He agreed. Pratt looked between them with the expression of someone watching 2 people communicate in a shorthand they've developed faster than seems quite possible. "You've got time," Pratt said, "but not much." "Thank you, Harold," Ethan said. "I mean it." Pratt put his hat back on. "Just don't let him win," he said simply, and rode back down the road. The next 3 days were the hardest kind of hard, not dramatic hard, but sustained logistical detail. Heavy hard, the kind that grinds at a person not through a single blow, but through relentless accumulation. Ethan rode to the Brennan Ranch and the Cahill family, and Abigail went with him, which she was certain some of them found unexpected, and which she paid no attention to because there wasn't time. She sat in ranchers' kitchens, and at fence posts, and in a wagon bed on the South Ridge, and talked clearly, practically, without alarm about what the water rights claim meant for the collective table, what the continuous use doctrine established, what Carson had filed, and what a ruling in their favor would mean for every ranch in the valley. She didn't promise them things she couldn't guarantee. She gave them information, and she watched with the careful attention she'd developed over years of reading rooms and people, and the spaces between words as they listened. As the tension in them changed from fear of Blackwell to something more like the solid feeling of information received and processed. As they looked at Ethan, who vouched for what she said without elaborating in the understated way that carried more weight than any elaboration, and decided that they were going to wait for the county board. Mrs. Wyeth, who was 63 and had outlasted 2 husbands and a flood and a cattle disease that had taken half the valley's herd in 1878, served them coffee in her front room and listened to everything Abigail said without interrupting. When Abigail finished, Mrs. Wyeth was quiet for a long moment. "You're the Turner girl," she said finally. "Harlan Turner's daughter." "I am," Abigail said. "Your mother was a smart woman." Mrs. Wyeth looked at her steadily. "Wasted in that house." Abigail held very still. "She'd be pleased," Mrs. Wyeth said in a matter-of-fact tone that left no room for sentiment, but was somehow more moving than sentiment would have been. "Seeing you here, doing this." She picked up her coffee cup. "I won't sign anything with Blackwell. You have my word on that." "Thank you, ma'am," Abigail said. Mrs. Wyeth looked at Ethan. "You chose well," she said with the directness of a woman who has been alive long enough to say what she means. Ethan glanced at Abigail. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I know." They drove back to the ranch that evening in the particular quiet of 2 people who have been working hard together all day and have nothing left to perform at each other. She was tired in her bones. He was tired the same way. The mountain air was cooling toward the first hint of August, and the stars were coming out over the ridge, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched them appear one at a time. "My mother used to say, the stars came out faster up high," she said. "They do," he said. "Less air between you and them." She considered that. "That's what this place is like," she said. "Less air between things." She paused. "I don't mean that as a complaint." He glanced at her. "I know you don't." She looked at the stars. "My mother would have loved it up here," she said. It was the first time she'd said anything like it aloud, and she heard her own voice do something soft on the word loved that she hadn't entirely intended. He didn't try to do anything with it. He just let it be there. "Tell me about her," he said. So she did. For the remaining mile and a half to the ranch, she told him about her mother, not the way you tell a story to impress someone, but the way you tell it when you've been carrying it for a long time, and someone has created enough silence around you that it has somewhere to go. Her mother's laugh, her mother's hands, the way her mother had read to her from whatever books she could find and told her that a woman who knew things was a woman who couldn't entirely be taken. The kerchief. He listened without interrupting. When they reached the ranch and the wagon stopped, she finished the last thing she'd been saying, and the silence after it was full rather than empty. "She sounds like someone worth missing," he said. "She was," Abigail said. "She is." He got down from the wagon and came around and put his hand up. She took it and stepped down, and this time he held it for longer, 3 seconds, 4, and when she was steady on the ground, he didn't let go immediately. She looked at him. "Abigail," he said. "Don't," she said softly. Not harsh. Just not yet. He heard it. He let go. "All right," he said. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment before she lit the lamp, her hand on the table, feeling the solidity of the wood under her palm. This table, this kitchen, this mountain. She lit the lamp. The letter from her father arrived on a Friday. She knew what it was before she opened it. The handwriting. The weight of it. The particular way her father addressed correspondence with her name, written like a transaction rather than a name. She opened it at the kitchen table, while Ethan was in the far pasture. It was short. He had heard through sources he did not name that the Cole Ranch was in the middle of a legal dispute over water rights. He wrote that he hoped she was conducting herself appropriately given the difficulty. He wrote that if the situation proved untenable, she was of course welcome to come home, and they would find some other arrangement. She read it twice. Then she set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. She thought about coming home. She thought about what home meant: her father's kitchen that she had cooked in for 12 years, her father's accounts that she had managed without acknowledgement, her father's house where she had been a function before she had been a person. She thought about the gate she had walked through with a trunk and a cloth bag and her mother's kerchief, and the particular expression of a woman who has decided not to cry about something she cannot change. She picked up the letter. She folded it. She put it in the stove. She watched it catch. Then she went back to the account ledger and the day's work, and she did not think about her father's house again, except as a thing that used to be and was no longer relevant, the way you stop thinking about a road once you've found where you're going. Ethan came in at noon and looked at her face and said, "Everything all right?" "Fine," she said. "Letter from my father." He was quiet for a moment. "What did it say?" "That I could come home if things got difficult." She looked up from the ledger. "I burned it." Something moved through his expression, careful, contained, but real. "Good," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Ethan." "Yeah." "What you said earlier this week about what you were hoping for." He went very still. He had the quality of a man who has trained himself not to reach for things and was now in the middle of unlearning it in real time. "I remember," he said. "I'm not afraid of it anymore," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not there yet. I don't know exactly what I am, and I'm not going to say things I'm not certain of. But I'm not afraid of it." He set his hat on the hook by the door. He came to the table and pulled out the chair beside her, the same one as before, beside rather than across, and sat down. "That's enough," he said. "That's more than enough." She looked at him directly. This man who fixed things before they broke, who held her hand 1 second longer than necessary, and then let go when she asked him to, who sat beside rather than across, and meant it. "I need you to know something," she said. "Tell me. I came up this mountain because I had no choice. That's the truth. My father sent me, and I had nowhere else to go, and I was practical about it." She held his gaze. "But I'm staying because I'm choosing to. That's different. I need you to know the difference." His eyes were very steady on hers. "I know the difference," he said quietly. "And I need you to know that the second one is the only one that matters to me." She looked at him for one long, full moment. Then she picked up her pencil and turned back to the ledger, and he reached across and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd left on the table, and they sat together in the kitchen in the particular, comfortable silence of two people who have said the important things and don't need to fill the space where they landed. Walt came to the kitchen door an hour later and looked in and then looked away with great deliberateness and said through the screen, "Carson sent word. The county board has set a hearing date, 3 weeks." Ethan looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Ethan. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, he agreed. She turned back to the ledger, and he picked up his hat and went back out, and Walt stood at the screen door for a moment longer, with the expression of a man who has been on this mountain for 12 years and has just seen something he was beginning to think he might never see, and felt the particular uncomplicated happiness of being present for it. He went back to work. Inside the kitchen, Abigail pressed her mother's kerchief briefly between her fingers under the table where no one could see. Still here, she thought. And this time the word here meant something specific. Something with a name. Something she had walked toward without knowing it through a gate on a summer morning with everything she owned in a single trunk in the direction of a life that had been waiting for someone patient enough to find it. She opened the next page of the ledger. She had 3 weeks to make sure nothing fell apart before the hearing. She got to work. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the kind that aged a person quietly. Not dramatically, not in ways that showed on the outside. But every morning, Abigail woke before the sun and lay still for a moment in the narrow bed that had become without her, entirely noticing, when simply her bed, not a stranger's spare room, not a temporary arrangement, but the specific place where she slept and dreamed and gathered herself for the day, and she felt the weight of what was coming, pressing down through the ceiling like a hand on her chest. She didn't let it stop her. She got up, she made coffee, she worked. The 3 weeks held their own series of small emergencies and quiet victories, the way 3 weeks always do when something large is building at the far end of them. The feed storage frame went up clean and solid. Cord and Davy working with a focused pride that told her they understood this was more than lumber and nails. It was proof that the storm hadn't broken what it hit. The mare's leg healed. Walt's back went out on the 2nd week, and she made him a compress from the same herbs she used on the horses and told him to stay off it for 2 days, which he argued about and then did, because Ramon told him to do what the woman said. The accounts balanced in a way they hadn't in 2 years. And Ethan. Ethan was steady in the particular way of a man who has decided something and is living inside that decision without needing to announce it. He didn't push. He didn't crowd. He did what he'd said he would do. He went slow, which in practice meant he was simply present in ways that accumulated over 3 weeks into something she felt in the architecture of every day. The way he saved the last of the coffee for her without thinking about it. The way he always told her where he was going when he left the main property, not as an accounting of himself, but as an assumption that she'd want to know which she did. The way he sat beside, rather than across. She was in the middle of loving him, and hadn't said so yet, and they both knew it, and neither of them forced it. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She came downstairs at 2 in the morning and found him already at the kitchen table with a cup of something, and the documents spread in front of him. Not reading them, she could tell by the way his eyes were sitting on the page without moving that he wasn't reading, just keeping himself company with the paper. He looked up when she came in. "Can't sleep either," she said. "No." She poured herself water and sat across from him and looked at the documents. She'd read every one of them so many times she could have recited them in her sleep if she'd been sleeping. "We're prepared," she said. "I know. Carson is ready. Walt is ready. Red Hawk confirmed he'll be there. I know all of that." "Then what is it?" He looked at her across the table. The lamp was low and the kitchen was quiet, and outside the mountain was doing what it did at 2 in the morning in August, which was hold everything still and enormous and dark. "What if it's not enough?" he said. She looked at him. "It's enough," she said. "You don't know that." "No," she said. "But I know that we've done every single thing that could be done, and we've done it right, And if it's not enough after all of that, then it was never going to be enough regardless, and there will be another way. She held his gaze. I did not walk up this mountain and learn every inch of this land and drag 41 cattle through a storm and burn my father's letter to let Victor Blackwell take the spring, Ethan. I need you to believe that. He was very still. I believe it, he said. Then go to sleep. He almost laughed. She heard the edge of it unexpected and warm. Yes, ma'am, he said. He gathered the documents and put them in the box. He stood and picked up the lamp and paused by her chair. Abigail, he said. I know, she said softly. He went upstairs. She sat in the dark kitchen for a few minutes longer, her hands around her water glass, feeling the solid weight of the house around her. The walls Ethan had built the floor. He'd laid the table. They'd sat across from each other 100 times now, in the 2 months since she'd walked through the gate with a trunk and her mother's kerchief, and nothing else she could count on. She pressed the kerchief to her wrist. Still here, she thought. Then she went to bed and slept 4 solid hours, which was enough. The county records hearing was held in the main hall of the Ridgeline Courthouse, which was a plain room with plain chairs and a long table at the front, where the 3-member records board sat, with the careful solemnity of people who understood that what happened in this room had real consequences for real people. Abigail had expected Blackwell to come himself. He did. He came in 5 minutes before the hearing started, flanked by Henderson and another lawyer she didn't recognize, dressed in the kind of clothes that were meant to remind everyone in the room of the distance between his resources and theirs. He looked at Ethan and nodded with the measured cordiality of a man who has already decided how this ends. He looked at Abigail, and something moved in his eyes that she couldn't name, not respect, not quite, but the adjustment a predator makes when it realizes the terrain has changed since the last time it was here. She looked back at him steadily and said nothing. Carson was already at the table on their side. Walt sat beside him back straight, despite the protest she knew he was getting from his spine. Red Hawk sat at the end of the row with the same unhurried stillness he always carried, and the room adjusted itself subtly around him, the way rooms do in the presence of someone who has outlasted a great many things. The board chairman, a gray-haired man named Fletcher, who had the demeanor of someone constitutionally opposed to drama, called the hearing to order. Henderson presented first. He was good. Abigail had expected him to be good, and he was methodical. Precise, building the survey discrepancy argument in careful layers, citing the 1879 resurvey, with documentation establishing the 40-foot boundary question with the confidence of a man who has practiced this presentation and knows where every piece lands. She watched the board members' faces as he talked. Fletcher was listening without expression, which told her nothing. The woman to his left, a records official named Caldwell, was taking notes, which was good. The man to Fletcher's right, younger, a county surveyor by trade named Briggs, no relation to Walt, was looking at Henderson's survey documents with the focused attention of a professional. Briggs was the one she was watching. When Henderson finished, Carson stood. Carson had been practicing law in Ridgeline for 22 years, and he presented the way a man presents who has no need to perform because the facts are doing the work for him. Walt's testimony. First, the first-hand account of the 1871 marker placement, the surveyor's argument, the spring's position relative to the boundary. Walt delivered it in the direct, unembellished way of a man who was there and remembers and has no particular investment in making it sound like more than it was, which made it land harder than any polished account could have. Then Red Hawk. He spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke about the spring and the land above it, and the water table and the communities that had used the watershed for longer than any county record existed. And he spoke without notes from a memory that was clearly and absolutely reliable, and by the end of it, the room was very quiet. Briggs, the county surveyor, had stopped taking notes. He was just listening. Henderson objected twice. Fletcher sustained neither objection. Then Carson set Abigail's continuous use analysis on the table in front of the board. This document, Carson said, was prepared by Abigail Cole, who manages the Painted Ridge operations. It cross-references 16 years of uncontested water use with the county's own continuous use doctrine, which I direct the board's attention to in Section 4 of the County Land Code. Fletcher picked it up. He read it. He handed it to Caldwell. She read it. She handed it to Briggs. Briggs read it and set it down and looked at Henderson. "Counselor," Briggs said, "the continuous use doctrine in Section 4. Are you prepared to address the Cole filings application of it?" Henderson's expression did something very small and very controlled. "The continuous use doctrine," Henderson said, "applies to use of a resource, not to the boundary question." "The boundary question," Briggs said not unkindly, "determines where the resource begins. If the use predates the 1879 resurvey and has been continuous and uncontested for 16 years, the doctrine would appear to establish intent regardless of the survey discrepancy." He looked at the document again. "This analysis is correct, Counselor. The doctrine applies." Henderson paused. It was a brief pause. Professional, contained. But Abigail saw it. Ethan felt her shift slightly in the chair beside him and looked at her, and she kept her eyes on the board because she didn't want to let go of it yet, didn't want to move until it was finished. But she felt the turn in the room, the way she'd felt the change in the storm, that shift in pressure, that moment when the air changes and you know which way the thing is going. Fletcher set down the analysis and looked at both tables. "We'll recess for 30 minutes, he said. The 30 minutes were the longest of Abigail's life, and she'd had some long ones. She stood in the hall outside the courtroom with Ethan on one side and Carson on the other, and Walt sitting on a bench nearby with his eyes closed, which she couldn't tell was prayer or rest and suspected was both. Red Hawk stood by the window and looked out at something she couldn't see. Across the hall, Henderson was speaking quietly to Blackwell. Blackwell was listening with his back straight and his face composed and his hand making a small controlled gesture that she'd learned to read as a man recalibrating his expectations. She looked at Carson. "Briggs," she said quietly. "Yes," Carson said. He understood the analysis. He's a surveyor. He knew the law. Your document made the argument he was already inclined to make. Carson straightened his papers. "You built the road, Mrs. Cole. You gave him the road and he took it." She looked at the closed courtroom door. "It's going to be all right," Ethan said beside her. She looked at him. "I know," she said. And she did. Not with the forced certainty she'd used at 2 in the morning to hold them both steady, but with the real thing, the solid, documented, testified, and cross-referenced knowledge that they had done every single thing right, and the truth was on their side. And sometimes that was enough. Sometimes the truth was enough. The courtroom door opened. "Say," Fletcher read the determination in the flat, careful tone of a man who takes seriously that what he says next will be on the record permanently. The board found the continuous use doctrine applicable. The board found Walt's testimony credible and consistent with historical record. The board found Red Hawk's account compelling and unrebutted. The board found that the intent of the original filing, taken together with 16 years of open and uncontested use, established the spring as within the protected claim of Painted Ridge Ranch beyond the reasonable interpretation of the survey discrepancy. The challenge was denied. The Painted Ridge water rights claim stood intact. The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds after Fletcher finished reading. Then Walt made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite something else, but was definitely from somewhere deep and real, and Ramon, who had come to the courthouse without being asked, put his hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder from the row behind, and Carson closed his folder with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done his job well. Ethan turned to Abigail. She was looking at the board, at the document in Fletcher's hands, at the permanent record of a thing that had almost been taken and wasn't. She felt Ethan turn toward her, and she turned to face him. His face was open. That was the word. The containment he wore as a matter of habit. The careful management of a man who'd been alone so long that the default was held, was open in a way she hadn't seen before, in the uncomplicated way of something that has been let go. "You did this," he said. "We did this." "Abigail, we did this," she said again firmly. "Walt did this. Red Hawk did this. Carson did this." She looked at him. You built something worth protecting for 16 years, and that's why it was worth protecting now. I just helped you show people what was already there." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand right there in the Ridgeline courthouse with Carson beside them, and Walt still making sounds, and the board packing up their papers, and Henderson and Blackwell's quiet departure happening in the peripheral vision of everyone in the room. He held her hand, the way he'd held it getting down from the wagon, not brief, not transactional, the way you hold something you intend to keep. She let him. Blackwell stopped them on the courthouse steps. She'd half expected it. Men like Victor Blackwell didn't walk away from a loss without a last word, not because they were foolish, but because the last word was its own kind of power proof that they were still present, still capable of being heard. He was alone. Henderson was already at the horses. He looked at them both with the composed expression of a man in the process of deciding how to carry this. "Cole," he said. Ethan looked at him. "Well done," Blackwell said, and his voice was even. "Your filing was thorough." "Thank you," Ethan said. Blackwell's eyes moved to Abigail. He studied her for a moment with that recalibrating quality she'd seen in the courtroom. "Mrs. Cole," he said. "Mr. Blackwell. That analysis was yours." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Carson told me you read the county law index on your own." "I did." Something moved through his expression, not defeat exactly. More like the adjustment of a man encountering something he hadn't mapped in advance and is updating his understanding of the terrain. "Your father," he said, "is a fool." She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "He is." Blackwell looked at Ethan for one last moment. "The East Ridge," he said. "I'll find another water source." "I imagine you will," Ethan said. Blackwell walked down the courthouse steps and did not look back, which was, she thought, the most honest thing he'd done since she'd met him. She watched him go. "That's it," Ethan said quietly. "That's it," Carson said from behind them, appearing with his coat and his folder. "He's not stupid. He knows when a position is untenable. He'll redirect." He looked at Abigail. "You won't have more trouble from him directly. He may try again in 10 years different angle, but not directly. Not after today." She breathed in, she breathed out. The August sun was full and warm, and the main street of Ridgeline was going about its business around them, and she felt for the first time in a very long time the specific sensation of being on solid ground. They stopped at the general store on the way out of town because Walt needed liniment for his back, and Cord had asked for tobacco, and Abigail had a supply list in her coat pocket that she'd been carrying for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. She was at the counter going through the list when she heard someone behind her say her father's name. She turned. 2 women near the fabric display. She recognized one of them, a Mrs. Aldridge who had been a neighbor of her father's for years, the kind of woman who existed in the particular social register of people who know everyone's business and consider this a civic duty. Mrs. Aldridge had noticed her noticing and had the grace to look slightly caught. "Miss Turner," she said, the old name, the maiden name, the daughter of Harlan name. "Mrs. Aldridge," Abigail said. "It's Cole now." Mrs. Aldridge blinked. "Of course. I'd heard that as your father mentioned we weren't sure how things had worked out for you up on the mountain." "They've worked out well," Abigail said. "Your father must be pleased." She looked at Mrs. Aldridge steadily. "I couldn't say," she said. And then Ethan was beside her. She felt him before she heard him, that specific presence, that reliable warmth, and he put his hand at the small of her back with the natural ease of a man who has been doing it for years, which he hadn't been, but which felt true. "Ready," he said. "Ready," she said. She turned back to the counter and finished her list, and Mrs. Aldridge was still somewhere behind her, but had become entirely irrelevant. The way people become irrelevant when you've stopped needing their opinion to know who you are. The drive back up the mountain was quiet and long and entirely comfortable. Walt fell asleep in the back of the wagon within the first 10 minutes, which Ramon had predicted. Cord and Davy had ridden back earlier. It was just the two of them, on the seat, the mountain road rising, the late afternoon light coming through the pines at an angle that turned everything gold. She had her mother's kerchief in her coat pocket. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about how to say it for about 3 weeks, and I haven't found a better way than just saying it." He kept his eyes on the road. "I know you said you needed time, and I told you I wasn't going anywhere. I meant that. I still mean it." He paused. "But I also need to be honest with you about something." "Then be honest," she said. He looked at her then directly the way he did when something was real. "I don't want you here because I need someone to run the household," he said. "I don't want you here because you're good with accounts, or because you know where the cattle go in a west wind, or because you kept us from losing the spring." He held her gaze. "I want you here because when I come in from the pasture and you're at that table, I know I'm home. Not just on my land, home." A pause. "And I've been on this mountain for 16 years, and I have never once felt that until you came through my gate." The wagon moved through the dappled afternoon light. She looked at him for a long moment. "I burned my father's letter," she said. "I know. I burned it because there was nothing in it I wanted, nothing to go back to, nothing that was mine." She held his gaze. "This is mine. This mountain, this ranch, this table you keep sitting beside me at." Her voice was very steady. "You are mine, Ethan Cole, if you want to be." He stopped the wagon. Walt stirred in the back and then resettled. The pines stood around them. The road curved ahead toward home. "I want to be," he said. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it the same way he'd held it on the courthouse steps, with intention, with the kind of grip that was not about strength, but about meaning. They sat like that for a moment on the mountain road, with everything still and full around them. Then he looked forward, clicked the reins, and the wagon moved. Tarkating. Fall came to Painted Ridge, the way fall comes to the high mountain country gradually, and then all at once, the aspens going gold in the second week of September, the air sharpening the light, changing its quality from the flat brightness of summer to something more angled and thoughtful. The corrective amendment was entered permanently into the county record on the 14th of September. Carson sent word with a writer a single sentence on official paper. "The filing is complete and the record is clear." Abigail put the letter in the wooden box with the rest of the ranch documents, beside Walt's testimony, beside Red Hawk's account, beside the deed to the land and the water rights and the 16 years of ledger books and the 3 months of her own handwriting that now filled more pages than any year before it. She closed the box. She went out to the yard where Ethan was splitting wood for the winter stores, the clean sound of it carrying across the cold air, and she stood on the porch and watched him work, and felt the particular peace of a person who has arrived somewhere they didn't know they were looking for. He saw her and stopped. "It's done," she said. "The filing is permanent." He set the axe down. He walked across the yard and up the porch steps and stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him in that way she'd developed over 3.5 months, the way you look at someone when you've stopped being careful about what your face does. "It's done," he agreed. He put his hands on either side of her face, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the way you touch something you've been waiting to touch, and he kissed her. It was not a complicated kiss. It was the kind of kiss that had been a long time coming, and knew it, the kind that had been built on 2 months of coffee at 4:30 in the morning, and ledgers and storms and hands held 1 second longer than necessary, and it tasted like the truth of all of that. She put her hands over his and kissed him back. Behind them in the barn, Walt Briggs told Ramon something that Ramon already knew, and Cord Hatch grinned at the ground, and Davy said, "About time." And Ramon said nothing, because some things didn't need saying. Her father came in October. She'd been expecting it not because she wanted it, but because she knew men like Harlan Turner, and men like Harlan Turner came around when they heard about success, the way they came around when they heard about trouble, which was whenever they thought there was something in it for them. He rode up the road on a Tuesday, with his hat at the apologetic angle, and his face arranged in the expression she recognized as remorse, adjacent the one he used when he wanted something, and had calculated that remorse was the most efficient path to it. Ethan was in the house with her when he arrived. She felt Ethan's hand at the back of her chair, not touching her. Just present, just there, and she appreciated it and didn't need it, which was exactly the right thing. She went to the door. Her father took off his hat. "Abigail," he said, "you're looking well." "Papa," she said. He looked past her into the house, then back at her. "I heard about the water rights thing," he said. "Word got around the valley. People are talking about what you did." He cleared his throat. "I wanted to come, and I'm proud of you. I want you to know that." She looked at him. She thought about this kitchen garden. 12 years of it. She thought about the morning he'd told her she was a problem he was finished carrying. She thought about the letter she'd burned in the stove, and the way the paper had gone fast all at once, nothing left. She thought about her mother's kerchief in her coat pocket, always there, always warm from her body. "I know you believe that," she said. He looked at her. He was expecting something, forgiveness maybe, or the door opened wide, or the daughter who'd needed him for so long that she still did. She could see him looking for it. "I'm glad you rode up," she said. "I want you to know that I'm well, that this is my home, and I'm happy in it." She held his gaze. "But I need you to understand something, Papa. I don't need you to be proud of me. I don't need your opinion of me to know what I'm worth." She kept her voice even. "I know what I'm worth. I've known for some time now. I just had to get far enough away from you to remember it." Harlan Turner's face moved through several things. Hurt was in there. So was something that might have been recognition, the slow and uncomfortable kind that arrives too late to be useful. "Abigail, you can come in for coffee," she said. "You're welcome to see the ranch and meet the people here. But I'm not going back to being the person I was in your house, and I'm not going to pretend that what happened didn't happen." She looked at him steadily. "Those are my terms. If that works for you, come in." He stood on the porch with his hat in his hands, and then slowly he nodded. He came inside. She made coffee. Ethan shook his hand and said little and meant it. Walt was politely cool. Ramon was entirely invisible in the way Ramon could be when he chose to be. Harlan Turner sat at the kitchen table of Painted Ridge Ranch and drank coffee in the house his daughter ran and looked at her, and for once in his life did not say much. When he left an hour later, he hugged her at the door, briefly, awkwardly, the hug of a man who'd waited too long to learn how to do it. She let him. She didn't hold on. She watched him ride back down the mountain road, and she felt the particular complex thing that is not forgiveness and not anger, but something more honest than both the acceptance that some people give you exactly what they're capable of and not one thing more, and the decision to stop measuring that against what you needed and simply note it for what it is. She turned back into the house. Ethan was at the table with his coffee, not looking at the door, giving her the privacy of the moment. "All right," he asked. "Yes," she said. And she was. On the 1st of November, when the mountain had gone fully into the sharp and brilliant cold of early winter, the county recorder in Ridgeline updated the Permanent Land Registry of Colorado. Under Painted Ridge Ranch, water rights claim the record now read, Ethan Cole and Abigail Cole. Joint stewards established claim, confirmed with prejudice. Joint stewards. She hadn't asked for it. Ethan had gone to Carson with the request on a Thursday morning while she was doing accounts and had said, according to Carson, approximately 12 words total, which was her name, belongs on the land she saved, and I won't have it otherwise. Carson had sent the paperwork. She'd signed it without making a thing of it, which was difficult, because it was the thing under all the other things, the one that said, not borrowed, not temporary, not a problem, someone else is done carrying. Hers. The name on the land. The night she signed it, she sat on the edge of the bed and held her mother's kerchief in both hands for a long time. She thought about her mother's voice reading to her by lamplight. She thought about the thing her mother had told her, that a woman who knew things was a woman who couldn't entirely be taken. She pressed the kerchief to the inside of her wrist over her pulse. She'd been taken from her father's house like something expendable. She'd been delivered to a mountain gate and left in the dust of a summer road. She'd been the daughter nobody wanted the woman, nobody chose the burden her family was finished carrying. And she had walked through that gate on her own 2 feet. She had learned every inch of this land. She had read the county law by lamplight and cross-referenced the doctrine and built the argument that saved the spring and the 3 ranches downstream and the farming collective and the water table that fed the valley. She had come to the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, and she had stayed not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had chosen with full knowledge and open eyes to stay. She set the kerchief on the nightstand. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went to the door and called down the hallway. "Ethan?" He appeared at the bottom of the stairs looking up. "Come see this," she said. He came upstairs. She showed him the kerchief on the nightstand. Just the kerchief. Just the small square of cotton that had been in her pocket for every day of her life since her mother died, her one held thing, her carried proof that she had been loved once by someone who saw her clearly. He looked at it and then at her. "She would have wanted to meet you," Abigail said. He was quiet for a moment. "I'd have wanted to meet her," he said. She looked at him in the lamplight of the room that was hers, in the house that was hers on the mountain, that had her name on its record now, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not the thing she'd been told to hope for, not the diminished and conditional version of belonging that her father's house had offered. The real thing. The one she had built with her own hands and her own knowledge and her own stubborn refusal to become the person that being discarded tries to make you. She was not the daughter nobody wanted. She was Abigail Cole of Painted Ridge Ranch. And this mountain knew her name, and the man standing in her doorway had chosen her every single day since she'd walked through his gate, and she had chosen him back. And that choosing mutual clear-eyed earned was the only thing that had ever mattered. "Come downstairs," she said. "I'll make supper." He tipped his head, that slight cowboy gesture that was just his, entirely his. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They went downstairs together, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the mountain held the first snow of November in its high places, and the spring ran clear and cold and uncontested through the rock. Below Painted Ridge, the way it had always run, the way it would always run, because sometimes the truth is enough, and sometimes the people who fight for it win, and sometimes a woman who was sent away like a problem becomes the very thing that holds everything together. Not because someone finally saw her worth, because she never stopped knowing it herself.